Warning: the following program contains blunt political commentary, strong language, and discussions of government corruption, immigration fraud, and ongoing federal investigations. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed on this show belong to the hosts and panelists and are not intended for those who prefer sanitized news, corporate narratives, or carefully curated talking points. If you are easily offended, overly sensitive, or rely on CNN for emotional support, this episode may not be suitable for you. Proceed at your own risk.
Minnesota likes to pretend it's America's polite, drama-free heartland. But this week, the snow isn't the only thing piling up. Federal investigators are swarming the state after the biggest fraud scandal in Minnesota history exploded into the national spotlight, revealing fake nonprofits, shell companies, and political leaders who were too scared, or too invested, to stop it. And just as Democrats tried to wave it all away as misunderstandings, new money trails started surfacing, raising red flags about where the stolen cash actually went. And then Trump stepped in. No hesitation, no soft language, no task forces. He pulled the plug on TPS for Somalis, told Minnesota officials their sanctuary-era excuses were done, and made it clear that federal cleanup time had officially begun. While Democrats melt down on cable news, the message from the White House is simple. If a state can't control the corruption on its own streets, Washington will. Tonight, we're breaking down the chaos, the fraud, the political panic, and the president's decision to hit Minnesota with the biggest immigration reversal they've faced in decades. Let's get into it. All right, folks, let's bring in the crew, because today's story is one of those moments where every angle matters. Minnesota is in the middle of a political meltdown. Trump just flipped TPS for Somalis on its head, and the media is trying to spin this thing so hard you'd think CNN was running on a hamster wheel. So I've got the full panel here, each with their own take on how we got here and what comes next. Because this isn't just a local corruption story anymore. This is a national security mess, a political liability, and a cultural grenade that both parties have been terrified to touch for years. First up is Brian, already fired up about the fraud, the money trails, and the fact that Democrats only discover corruption when a Republican points it out. If you think he held back yesterday, buckle up. He's basically vibrating in his seat today. Then we've got Rachel, the independent conscience of this whole operation. She's the one who'll remind us that yes, fraud is real, yes, oversight collapsed, but also yes, what Trump just did with TPS is going to have real consequences that we shouldn't ignore. She's ready to ground this conversation in facts, even if it means stepping between the ideological fists flying in the room. Next is Daniel, who has already pulled out enough notes, red string, and conspiracy threads to decorate a Christmas tree. Anytime there's federal money missing, shady nonprofits, and politicians yelling racism as a last-ditch shield, you know Daniel's already connecting dots the rest of Washington pretends not to see. And rounding it out, of course, is Skylar. She's here to defend the humanity of the Somali community and remind us that not every person tied to TPS is part of the fraud. And she'll gladly tell you Trump's decision is cruel, reckless, and classic fear-mongering. Expect sparks when Brian jumps in. So that's the squad. Let's get into the meat of it. Because Minnesota didn't just stumble into this mess. They drove straight into it, ignored every warning sign, and now the White House is flipping the lights on. Let's go. All right, let's dive in. Because Minnesota is officially the political equivalent of a frozen-over septic tank the state tried to pretend was a Christmas skating rink. For years, we've been told, by Walz, by Keith Ellison, by Ilhan Omar, by every Democrat who thinks the word racism is a magic shield, that everything is fine. There is no fraud. There is no corruption. There is no clan-based political pressure. There is no misuse of welfare programs. There is no terrorism connection. And then, boom. Federal investigators show up like they finally got tired of the state pretending to be blind. And suddenly, the truth smells worse than low tide in the Mississippi. Trump didn't just call Minnesota out. He slapped the state with federal oversight, axed TPS for Somalis nationwide, and basically said, if Minnesota officials won't guard the hen house, the feds will. And the meltdown on CNN has been so dramatic you'd think they were broadcasting from a sauna. Brian, start us off, because you've been chomping at the bit for this one.
Artie, chomping at the bit isn't even close. I've been waiting years for this moment, for someone in power to finally stop pretending Minnesota's Somali-related fraud scandals are just cultural misunderstandings. No, they're not misunderstandings. They're criminal enterprises protected by Democrats who are terrified of losing a voting bloc they treat like a sacred cow. We just watched the largest COVID-era fraud scheme in the entire country happen in Minnesota because Walz and his people refused to shut it down. Fake nonprofits claiming they were feeding thousands of hungry children, shell companies popping up like mushrooms after rain, millions flying out the door to buy luxury homes, overseas trips, jewelry, and God knows what else. And the state didn't stop it. Federal prosecutors did, because Minnesota leadership wouldn't touch it if you handed them hazmat suits. And now investigators are digging deeper, and guess what? Suddenly the money trails are looking international. Suddenly there are whispers about funds reaching Somalia. Suddenly the Treasury Secretary is sniffing around al-Shabaab connections. And Democrats are still standing there going, "No, don't look over there. That's racist." Meanwhile, Trump walks in and does what every cowardly blue state governor refused to do. He pulled the plug on TPS and said, "Clean your house." And I'll go further. Ending TPS isn't even extreme. It's overdue. We're not talking about 50,000 people. It's a few hundred nationwide. But symbolically, it's Trump telling every corrupt operator in Minnesota's underbelly, America isn't your playground anymore. You commit fraud, you play games with federal money, you flirt with terror networks, you go home. And the fact that Democrats are screaming louder than anyone actually implicated tells me everything I need to know.
Brian coming in hot like a frostbitten flamethrower. And trust me, we're just getting started. Because the fraud is one part, but the political cowardice is the part that deserves a documentary. Rachel, let me bring you in, because you've been the one hammering on the oversight failures. And Minnesota didn't just fail. They practically held the door open and offered free snacks.
Look, Artie, the fraud is real, and the numbers are jaw-dropping. But let's not pretend Minnesota is the only state vulnerable to this kind of scheme. It's just the one that refused to act until the damage was too big to hide. The Feeding Our Future scandal wasn't just a criminal operation. It was a policy failure, an oversight failure, and a leadership failure. Walz's administration ignored whistleblowers, dismissed concerns, and allowed the Department of Education to rubber stamp reimbursements that made no sense on paper. When one nonprofit claims they fed more children than live in entire neighborhoods, that's not subtle. That's not culturally complicated. That's negligence. But here's where things get more complicated. Trump ending TPS doesn't fix the underlying systems that allowed this fraud to happen. TPS holders aren't the ones orchestrating billion-dollar schemes. They're working jobs, raising families, and trying to stay in legal status. Ending TPS is a massive symbolic move. And yes, I understand the message Trump is sending, but legally and practically, it's a blunt tool. It punishes people who weren't part of this. It affects families who've been here for decades. And if we want long-term reform, we need to fix the vulnerabilities in Minnesota's agencies, not just strip protections from a tiny population. The fraud needed cleaning up. The politics needed cleaning up. But we have to be clear-eyed. Some of Trump's moves, while decisive, come with real human fallout that shouldn't be ignored.
All right, Rachel coming in with the nuance, which we do need, even if Brian looks like he wants to throw his hat at the wall. But there's a bigger story underneath this, and Daniel's got it taped to the wall with red string. Because none of this fraud popped up overnight. Minnesota's been sitting on a powder keg, and anyone who said so got called every name in the book. Daniel, take us down the rabbit hole. Because you've been warning about these vulnerabilities for years.
Artie, this isn't a rabbit hole, it's a map. And the map is labeled, "We Told You So." Minnesota has been a mess for years because its political class is terrified of being labeled insensitive. Every time someone raised concerns about clan politics, social programs being exploited, or money being funneled through untraceable networks, the media shouted, "Racism," and shut down the conversation. Meanwhile, the fraud grew so big, the DOJ practically had to send in snowplows. And it's not just the feeding our future case, that's just the one too big to hide. There are layers here. Shadow nonprofits, political machines built on identity blocks, overseas money transfers nobody questioned, and state leaders who thought silence was safer than oversight. And here's the kicker. When investigators finally started connecting the dots, suddenly terror funding popped up in the conversation. Suddenly, there are open discussions about money leaving Minnesota and landing in the hands of Al-Shabaab affiliates. Do we know the full extent? No, because the same people who failed to stop the fraud are the ones who controlled the paperwork. But Trump sees the pattern. He knows you don't wait for the bomb to go off. You secure the perimeter. Ending TPS isn't random. It's strategic. Close the loophole, stop the pipeline, and force Minnesota officials to rebuild a system that isn't half Swiss cheese. The media calls it cruel. I call it overdue border hygiene.
Daniel turning oversight failures into a conspiracy mural the FBI probably already has a copy of. But we round out with Skylar, our progressive voice, who I'm sure is ready to tell us why Trump's move is heartless and why Minnesota is just misunderstood. Skylar, go for it.
Artie, this entire conversation is exactly why immigrant communities never trust conservative leadership. Yes, fraud happened. Yes, people committed crimes. But the way it's being discussed, like the entire Somali community is a ticking time bomb, is dangerous, misleading, and irresponsible. Minnesota's Somali population includes business owners, nurses, teachers, delivery drivers, and families who've lived there long enough to call the snow home. Reducing all of that to fraud factory rhetoric is exactly how we get policies that target innocent people instead of the criminals who deserve punishment. What Trump did with TPS is collective punishment. It doesn't address fraud. It doesn't target the people responsible. It affects people who've lived here legally for decades under U.S. protection because their home country is unstable. This is a political stunt dressed as security. And while Brian cheers and Daniel draws his red string maps, real families are sitting at home terrified they're going to lose everything. You want to fix fraud? Invest in oversight? Stop rubber stamping reimbursements, hold officials accountable. But punishing people who had nothing to do with this just deepens division and drives communities underground.
And that right there is the divide. Minnesota's corruption meets Washington's hammer, and every political worldview sees something different in the wreckage. But one thing nobody can deny is this. Minnesota let this mess grow. They let the narrative control the oversight. They let fear of bad headlines outweigh the need for accountability. And now Trump's stepping in because someone had to. Minnesota didn't want to deal with the problem, so now they're dealing with the consequences. All right, folks, before we land this plane, quick shout out to the people keeping this show alive. You and the merch store that funds this circus. And listen, with everything going on in Minnesota, you're going to want gear that says what you wish the politicians up there would. Clear, bold, unapologetic truth. We've got the Data and Dissonance coffee blends, High Lakes Light Roast, Rock Creek Medium, and the Bitterroot Dark Roast, for when CNN drives your blood pressure into low orbit and you need something strong enough to slap you back to reality. We've got hoodies, mugs, tumblers, trucker hats, the Gen X shirts, the bumper stickers, the tote bags, the beanies. Everything you need to rep the show while driving liberals insane at the grocery store. And yes, everything is still roasted, printed, and shipped right here in the USA because we don't outsource our voice or our values. So grab something today, support the show, and help us keep these lights on while we poke holes in the narratives the media praise nobody questions. You know, as we wrap this up, I keep thinking about how Minnesota ended up here. Not just the fraud, not just the money trails, but the culture that allowed it all to rot from the inside out. And it comes down to something we've seen happening across the country for years. Leaders choosing comfort over courage. Minnesota didn't become the epicenter of the biggest COVID fraud case in the country because the criminals were brilliant. It happened because the people in charge were terrified. Terrified of being called racist. Terrified of offending a voting bloc. Terrified of asking the hard questions the rest of America had been whispering for years. And that fear turned into paralysis. Paralysis turned into silence. And silence turned into an open door for corruption that grew far beyond what any state should ever tolerate. Meanwhile, the communities caught in the crossfire, Somali, American-born, immigrant, working class, everyone, were left with leadership that refused to protect them from exploitation. Money meant for children was stolen. Agencies meant to provide oversight looked the other way. And the media, instead of digging for truth, scolded anyone who asked for accountability. That's not compassion. That's cowardice disguised as empathy. And it cost real people real resources. So now we're in a moment where Trump, for better or worse, decided he wasn't waiting for the state of Minnesota to find a spine. He ended TPS for Somalis, a small group numerically but symbolically huge. A message that said, if your state won't fix the loopholes, the federal government will. And whether you agree with every part of that move or not, it's clear something dramatic had to happen, because this wasn't just a fraud case. This was a warning shot about what happens when political correctness overrides basic accountability. But here's the truth that nobody on the left wants to admit. If the state had done its job, Trump wouldn't have had to. If oversight had worked, he wouldn't be stepping in. If the media had been honest, this wouldn't be a national story. Minnesota had every opportunity to police itself. And it didn't. So now the cleanup isn't gentle, it isn't subtle, and it sure as hell isn't polite. But it's necessary. And maybe, just maybe, this becomes the moment the rest of the country finally understands what we've been saying on this show for years. Compassion without accountability invites corruption. And ignoring problems because the truth is uncomfortable doesn't make them go away. It just gives them room to grow. So, whether you agree with Trump's hammer or not, remember this. The strongest nations are the ones willing to confront their failures, not bury them. Minnesota tried to bury this one. The feds dug it back up. And the country is better off for it. All right, folks, that's going to do it for tonight. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought. Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. The books that prove one man with a mission, a code, and a past can shake the foundations of the deep state no matter how tightly they try to hide the truth. If you haven't jumped into it yet, start with Book 1, The Covenant Protocol, the story that launched the entire Rourke universe. Black Ops, covert alliances, shattered loyalties, and a conspiracy that threads through the highest levels of government. Then move to Book 2, The Prophet Directive, where Caleb finds himself chasing a shadow network bent on rewriting global power structures, pushing him deeper into a world where every ally might be an enemy and every truth has a price. And of course, Book 3, Black Echo Rising is on the horizon. A countdown into darkness, betrayal, and the kind of geopolitical danger that mirrors the chaos we talk about on this show every night. If you like high-stakes action, intelligence warfare, and morally complex heroes who don't back down, this is your series. Grab your copies now on Amazon, paperback, Kindle, or Audible, and dive into the world where fiction feels a little too close to reality.